We're going to start a new series here, and I don't know how long we'll go with this, but I wanted to take just a couple minutes to talk about some basic theology, understanding who God is, understanding what the church teaches, and every week we'll just do just a couple minutes. This first one might be a little longer than some, but again, 2 to 3 minutes is our goal. What I wanted to talk to you about today and over the next couple of weeks is understanding the character of God. What's hard about God and trying to understand God, especially for someone who's not been a very spiritually minded person, is that God seems to be described lots of different ways in the Bible. Sometimes He's described as holy. Isaiah 6:3 says, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty, and the whole earth is full of His glory." And holy is a big word, but for the purposes of what we're talking about right now, just think perfection. There's just morally, righteously perfect. But God's also called a God of wrath. And I guess at some level that makes sense because if you are completely holy and you're dealing with people who are not, then it's going to irritate you. But some of the language, this Nahum verse here, the Lord is jealous and avenging. The Lord takes vengeance and is filled with wrath. Well, I mean, it's a scary thing. It's a scary picture. And then also sometimes the Bible says that God is love. 1 John 4:8 says, "Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love." Okay, well, how do you juxtaposition? How do you tie those two things together? How can God be a God of wrath but also a God of love? And then we see this word grace pop up a lot in the Bible. "For it's by grace that you've been saved through faith, and this is not of yourself; it's a gift of God." And so what I wanted to do over the next just a couple weeks is talk about those four things: God's holiness and how God has wrath, how God has love, and how God shows grace, and just talk about those elements and how they relate to you so you can better understand what God's like, and if you can understand Him, and if you could even love a God like that, and I guess most importantly, could a God like that love you? I mean, can a God like that, who is holy and has wrath and love and grace, can He love me? And how do we think about that? So, first one, just jumping right in, I want to talk about God's holiness. And the Bible calls God a fire, a roaring fire. And in fact, one of the earliest pictures of God is a burning bush. And it just burns through something, but it doesn't consume it. And how you need to think about that when you're thinking about God's holiness is like the sun. I mean, the sun gives life, and the sun gives light, and it gives energy, but you can't get too close. It'd burn you up. And God is kind of like that in His holiness. He's transcendent. There's something about God in His perfection and in His righteousness that is so crazy far above us, it's hard to even calculate. There's a story in 2 Samuel chapter 6 where David is bringing the Ark of God into Jerusalem, and the Ark was supposed to be God's throne. It wasn't God Himself, but it's where God positioned Himself, and because of that, it was holy too, and nobody could get close to it, and there was a couple of rules about it, but one of them was you couldn't touch the Ark. And as they're bringing the Ark towards Jerusalem, it's in a cart, and the oxen who are pulling the cart stumbles, and the ark starts to fall out, and a guy named Uzzah puts his hand up and tries to stop it from falling out and getting on the ground, and he's dead. I mean, as soon as he touches it, he dies. And it infuriates David. David can't understand, how can a guy like me come close to a God who's that holy, who's that transcendent? In the New Testament, you see in Luke chapter 5 this picture of Jesus, and he and Peter are having a conversation, and he tells Peter, "I know you've been fishing all night, but why don't you take your nets and cast on the other side of the boat?" And Peter does it, and all of a sudden all the fish in the lake start jumping into his boat. I mean, he can't get them in fast enough. The boats are actually starting to sink because of this huge miracle. And then Peter does this crazy thing. He looks at Jesus and says, "You need to get away from me. I'm a sinful man." I mean, there's some knowledge with Peter that Jesus, you're different. You're holy. And it's that feeling that you can get sometimes when you're at the ocean or on top of a mountain or this really impressive sunset, or maybe in a dark church or a dark building at night when you're the only one there, and this feeling that you're all alone in the world and there's something else there, but it's much, much bigger, much, much more holy than you. J.I. Packer, in his book Knowing God, says that God reveals Himself. and that God lets you have just little glimpses of who He is. And when you think about the things we understand, like a rock, I mean, I understand a rock. I can pick it up and study it and become an expert in rocks without a lot of work. Some guys do that. Geologists can devote their whole life to the study of rock. And it's possible that if you spend a lot of time thinking about it, you could become such an expert about a rock that no one would know more about it than you did. You go a little more complicated, like to an animal, a cat or a dog, or in Packer's illustration, a horse. I mean, you can really get smart about the animal, but anybody who rides horses will tell you sometimes the horse will be quirky and you won't expect it to act like it did. I mean, you'll know so much about it, but it's more complicated than a rock. When you get to a man and you start thinking about what a man is like, well, he's much more complicated than a horse. I mean, a person could live, I mean, you hear it sometimes at funerals, somebody talking about their dad or about the husband. You know, I never really knew him. I lived in the same house with him and I didn't know him. Because a person can keep so much of themselves secret. They choose how much they reveal. Well, God is much more complicated than a man or a horse or a rock. And God lets you have little glimpses of who He is. If we had the whole picture, I'm not even sure we could handle it. And God in His glory starts to reveal who He is and what He's about. And He knows us, but He's so much different than us. And sometimes it can take your breath away. Michelangelo, in his famous painting on the Sistine Chapel, has this picture of God. And I've always found this part the most fascinating. I mean, all of it's interesting. But that part, I mean, the hands where they're coming together, all Adam has to do is just reach out his hand just a very little bit and he'll touch God, but he's not sure he wants to. I mean, you can see in his whole posture here, he's leaning away. He's not right up against God. He's not trying. Now God, all His muscles are flexed. He's coming, all the movement of the painting is this way. He's coming towards the man, but Adam's not sure. God, in spite of His difference, that can be so intimidating to us, in spite of His righteousness, which can be so scary for us, God still reaches. Even the very beginning of the Bible, sometimes it's called a fairy tale, but there's a difference between saying once upon a time and in the beginning. And once upon a time means there was a certain time and a certain place and everybody was there and we can think about that. But when you think about in the beginning, it means that God's above all that. He starts it. Sometimes like Adam, that can intimidate me so much that I don't want to reach out. But I think He's worth reaching out for, and I hope to talk about that in the next couple lessons.